Welcome to Unlayered. I'm your host Saul, and today we have a different format. I'm joined by our longtime ally and advisor Zen Llama, because our guest today, John Charbonneau of DBA, and Zen Llama, we want to all discuss and jam a bit on Solana fees. In other words, we want to demystify Solana fees and kind of get into the nitty gritty of the long-term vision for the Solana network, because it's just so fundamentally different from how ETH and the L2s handle fee markets. But I think a good way to start this episode actually is to kind of just tee up this problem from a historical perspective. Zen, I know you brought up earlier that this reminds you of kind of the big block, small block wars back in the day, 2017, with Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, and this war between bigger blocks versus smaller blocks. I mean, is that kind of how you see things playing out today in a way?
Yeah, so I gotta be like fully candid, and like I wasn't in the industry that at that time, but I have like read my history, right? And so like Bitcoin, right, being like it wasn't programmable, right? It was just like a form of money, and like how that money's like economic bandwidth was kind of like limited by the block space, right? So there was two camps. There was like one camp that essentially said we want to keep blocks small because it essentially has restricted supply on the block space and therefore it like drives, like scarcity, right? And kind of like store value type narratives. Then there was like the other camp that was like the Bitcoin Cash camp, right? And they essentially were like, we want bigger blocks. We want it to be more of like a medium of exchange. And that kind of like motivated like a lot of the conversation for a lot of time. Until Ethereum came in with like, it's like, hey, but we want this to also be programmable. And then maybe I can pass it over to John if he wants to expand on any of that, and we can then go into like Ethereum.
Yeah, sounds about right to me. I also, for background, was well before my time. Block size wars. It was way before I was in crypto as well. So much more of my entry is the Ethereum versus Solana versus Avalanche versus, go down the line. But yeah, I mean, that matches mine as well. Of like, you start to kind of see this classic split kind of throughout crypto of, especially in the last few years, of the kind of like the money versus crypto versus the tech crypto. And there's like inherently kind of a bit of that also kind of in the like, what should Ethereum be? What should Solana be?
Is it fair to say that ETH's monetary policy is inspired heavily by Bitcoin in a way, especially post EIP 1559?
Yeah, I think it's like kind of, it's funny because like it wasn't until EIP 1559, right? Like that was the main criticism from like Bitcoiners to Ethereans is like, oh, you guys are like minting infinitely, like you have no fundamentals, right? And like it's like, okay, well then they like, they took that seriously because the other biggest boy in the room was Bitcoin, right? And like came up with the IP 1559, which is actually a pretty elegant, controller mechanism for fees. And now we have like ultrasound money narrative, right? I think what was like lost in that, like as this transition was going on, was kind of like the philosophy like behind the big blockers, like kind of like the small blockers won the big block small block war, right? And but that being apparent by Bitcoin being the main fork, right? And so when Ethereum was fighting with Bitcoin, right, that's the camp they're like ideologically bumping up against, right? I think with Solana, it's like much more the small or the big block guys, right? Sorry, I think I messed that description up. Yeah. Yeah. I think I missed that description up a little bit, but the small block guys won, like Bitcoin won.
Right.
And so like there's this like very heavy like monetary policy slant. And I think the big blockers are like more like, hey, no, like we're more on like the world computer side. And so like what does that mean for the token? I think Totally has articulated this very well in the sense of saying like, no, the token is a spam prevention mechanism. And so yeah, I think we can get into what that means a little bit, but I think that kind of like motivates a lot of it, and like maybe we can just delve a little bit on like the Ethereum monetary policy and the motivation behind EIP 1559. John, if maybe you had some comments there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like 1559 is really interesting because it also seems to be kind of, I would say, especially lately, especially in the Solana community, coming more like full circle of like what the motivations actually were for it in the first place. And it's kind of gone through this arc of like the initial motivation for 1559 was not just to burn all the ETH and be this like deflationary, like it's good for ETH as money, like that wasn't the intention of it. It really was just the fact that it is a just better fee mechanism than what like Ethereum had in place, and it like actually just meaningfully improves the UX. Like it is a very elegant solution, and which is why people in the Solana community are starting to like look at it more recently again. And it's not for the monetary reasons of it. It is just the like, oh, this is actually just an intuitively simple thing of, I as a user want to basically know in most situations, like, what do I need to pay to get into the block? And then I just want to pay that thing and get into the block, and not have all these failed transactions and all these different problems. Like that was the motivation for Ethereum to do 1559 in the first place, was that it's a good UX improvement effectively. The reason that you burn the ETH, just historically, kind of for context, is like it's just an incentive compatibility byproduct of the mechanism of if you don't burn all the base fee and you have this dynamic base fee that the block producer can control, you basically, if you were to still send that to the block producer, well then like the game theory of it kind of just like falls apart and it reverts back to a first price auction, and then you basically end up with what you had before. So like that's the reason why you just have to burn it, is you just can't get it's not even that you have to burn it, it's that you can't give it to the current block producer. So you could send it into a treasury, you could do something else with it, but you can't give it to the current block producer. And where that kind of has gone since then is people have really honed in on that last part of like the burning aspect of it, as this is the differentiated like new meme kind of thing. But like that is why, I mean, like as the Solana's community is starting to look at it again of like, oh, is this interesting? Is there a way to work this into Solana's base fee mechanisms and, so some form modified? It's not as we want to burn more base fees. Like you could just burn more base fees if you want to do that. You could just change the parameter to burn 100% of the base fees today. Like it really is as that, like, just how do we design a good fee mechanism that is like good for users, and incentive compatible, and just deters spam and all these things. Like that was the real initial motivation for it, and it is a really good mechanism for all of those.
So maybe to kind of take this conversation along, what would be helpful is for both of you guys to, and from the perspective of a listener, delineate between what it means to be a validator on the Ethereum network versus the Solana network, and this idea of like the economic feasibility of being a validator, and even just the idea of the cost of running one on each network. Like philosophically, they're quite different, right? How do you kind of view both of those landscapes?
Yeah, I think like to follow up on what John said a little bit, like, there's technically nothing preventing, like, I mean, there is like technical reasons, like at the long tail of it, from like it's just like expanding the gas supply, right? Like that's literally what BNB did, but you run into like other like state growth problems, right? And so I think like Ethereum is very much motivated from this, like, okay, we want like people to run nodes at home. Therefore, like we don't want the hardware cost to be so high. And that means like our fee burning mechanism inherently has this like dynamic of like making the validator profitable, not because like they're just doing it because they want to, but because like if otherwise, like if there was too much state, like they would have problems on the hardware side, right? And so yeah, I think that's like the main motivation there, and then we can talk about Solana a little bit, but I'd like to hear what John thinks. Like,
yeah, no, I mean that definitely fits. It is an interesting byproduct because like a lot of it is also just like what is the cost to run a node versus the cost to be a validator, and those like actually are two different things. And especially in Solana, you see that very clearly. Like that is one of the more underappreciated, I would say, like costs. I think that most people probably just don't like intuitively think of like the cost to run a validator. It's really expensive to vote on every single block. Of that is a transaction every single block, and like most people always hang on to the fact that like, oh, most of the transactions are votes. Well, like that's true, but like they're like the problem is that there are economic implications of that. Is like it is expensive to run a validator for that. Like that costs like $10,000 a year usually, depending on what the SOL price is, to be one. And like that is actually part of the conversation also as well when people are talking about fee changes to Solana. Part of it is for various economic reasons of deterring spam and all these different things. But part of it is that also, as of right now, there's no like special exemption or treatment or anything for vote transactions. Like they're just treated like a normal transaction and they pay the same base fee that everyone else pays. And there's a lot of talk of, is that just like the fundamentally right thing to do? And like that is part of the conversation of like, we'll get into this much more later, but like changing the base fee to be based more on CUs or these different things, like helps the fact that today validators are relatively overpaying also for the resources that they consume on the network relative to the amount that they're actually paying. And Ethereum, you just, like any other chain, you don't actually have this because votes are not normally on-chain transactions in the same manner. And like the 400 millisecond block times, like you have a lot of votes, it gets really expensive. But yeah, and then also is like what you were mentioning of just like the simple stuff of like, yeah, the hardware requirements, just like everything that goes into like actually running the node is going to be a bit more expensive on Solana versus on Ethereum. The more practical reality too is an extent of like, while that's also true for running a node, in practice, most people who actually run validators are like actually sophisticated setups anyway. And, the incremental couple $100 of like, what does it cost to run this node versus that node is like not the difference in like, Coinbase's bottom line, obviously. It's like, it's all the same operational costs and like you're paying employees and all these different things.
What about this idea of, and I think this is something Zen and I talked about before, on Solana, there's a world where validators aren't even necessarily profitable. They could be even loss leaders in some ways. And where like the value driver to the token is not as emphasized perhaps as networks like Ethereum that have literally memified that. Do you think this is like a sustainable long-term model to just kind of assume that you could just have 3,000 or whatever the number is validators out there that may or may not be making money, spending $1,000 or so a month, and it's all good because it's about the apps at the end of the day. It's not really about like having a profitable industry centered on just the infrastructure side of running a blockchain.
Yeah, I think there's like actually a little bit of nuance here, and John kind of hinted at it when the fact that like votes are transactions on Solana, and like I think people underestimate the utility of like all-to-all communication, right? And the reason they do that is because if you can scale the number of transactions, you can scale the number of full nodes that can be on the network. And the theory is kind of like, okay, well, having a full node is actually an economic advantage in certain situations and just in like for app development, right? So having a full node gives you the data the fastest. You'll be able to have like the fastest UX, the fastest like seeing what's going in on chain versus like someone who's just like listening off an RPC. And essentially like, you're like in the actual quorum, right? And so that actually has like economic value for, people on dexes and traders and stuff like that, as well as like just having snappy UX and stuff. So I think the thought is kind of one along the lines of like, okay, if I'm a business and I'm going to go out and like get like a good server and I go to like AWS to ask them for one, right? Like I'm not going like, is this net profitable for my business? I'm like, no. I have a business that's profitable and I don't mind spending a little bit on the hardware to like get the advantage of that hardware, right? Now I don't know if I like fully agree with this. It's more of just like, this is the line of thinking, right? Like in my mind, like you need to have the network actually hit like zero, like in a non-contentious state. If you're just sending a transaction, that transaction should be the actual cost of sending it over the network for the validators to process it, right? And so in a perfect world where we were all just sending completely uncontentious transactions on the network, like I think the validators should just be like breaking even, in the sense that like they're motivated to run one if they're a hobbyist. If it's a business that's like a capex, it's not huge, right? And so they're also motivated to do like the work overhead of it. But that's where like the spam prevention comes in, right? And like I think the theory behind it is like, okay, well, if I have a really useful app and a lot of people are using it, people are going to be paying priority fees and like other fees to get like priority ordering or like block inclusion and stuff. And that's what we'll pay for both the validators and the network with like a 50-50 burn, which is kind of the thing John was talking about, of like why you need to burn some of it is because like it can't all go to the validator. They have like kind of, they can do malicious things with the fees. So.
Yeah, there's definitely that balance of, you know, the accessibility versus like actual utility of running the thing. Like there's two parts to getting people to run a lot of nodes. Like one of it is making it just as cheap as possible. The other half of it is making it really useful. If it's really cheap, but like it's not valuable to run a node, then nobody's going to run a node. If it's like sort of expensive, but it's super, you know, valuable to run a node, then a lot of people will run it. So yeah, similarly like that is the train of thought, especially in Solana. The part that I would say that is like fair arguments against that is that in particular, a lot of these kind of like performance and user benefits of that would incentivize you normally to run a lot of nodes. A lot of them are actually, I would say, more beneficial to have a lot of stake weight. And that is like probably an underappreciated side effect of things like Turbine and QoS, just like the way that they work, is like there actually are relatively centralizing economics on both of those, where you do get a large benefit if you have a lot of stake as opposed to like actually having a lot of nodes. So just context for the listener, the way that those work. So Turbine is the way that like blocks are propagated on Solana. I'm sure you guys have probably described this on the show before, but basic idea of like a block is, you know, kind of like chopped up into these different pieces and then fanned out across the network, kind of like through like a tree-like structure. And the way that those bits of the block are prioritized and like sent through that is based on stake weight, not the number of nodes. So the upshot of that is if you have a lot of stake weight, you're going to be the person who is going to most quickly get all the pieces of it and like understand and be able to update your view of the world of like, okay, this is the state of the world. That is something that is like very valuable for obvious MEV applications, like if you're a trader, all those things. Similarly for QoS, similar idea of like, if you have more stake weight, you have like a certain like larger amount of basically that your kind of bandwidth of like transactions of yours that will be prioritized that you're sending along to the next leader. And again, that is based on stake weight, not just having a lot of nodes. So those are like the fair arguments against. And like, I think that these are things that the network will have to grapple with in the longer term, because both of them are sensible things of you want to obviously like prevent Sybil attacks for all of these different things. Like the opposite of Turbine would be similar to like a little bit different, but like the way that like Avalanche consensus used to work. There was this problem where basically like the probability of getting the next block was actually just by running a node and not based on stake weight. And the result that you saw with that was searchers figured out like, oh yeah, it's a great idea if I just spin up thousands of nodes, and now it looks like someone is just attacking the network. So you need some way to Sybil prevent, but usually the ways to prevent Sybil attacks are like relatively centralizing economically. And the way that the Solana Foundation has dealt with this very well is like through their delegation program, which like is a very rational thing. It has like supported the decentralization of the network. So they like delegating to validators a certain amount of stake and like matching Sol beyond that. Like that helps kind of the costs of these validators, because I think the break even to run a Solana validator, it's something in the ballpark of like 40 or 50,000 Sol, something like that order magnitude. Beyond that, like you will get enough rewards off of that to generally compensate for your vote fees, your costs to run this thing, etc. So that works today, but is that like a long run sustainable thing to obviously have this delegation program that's like kind of subsidizing to some extent the bottom tier of stakers? Like probably not. So like those are going to be difficult economic questions in the long run, like dealing with all of those.
I think would be useful actually. I don't think a lot of people understand how different block production is on Solana versus ETH and the EVM chains. Can we quickly just do a rundown of like the key differences? And I think the biggest one is just the lack of a mempool on Solana versus ETH as a global mempool. But you alluded to some of these other ones, just how these packets are forwarded to leaders and what implications there are for certain features of Solana. Maybe that would be a great way to just set this baseline foundation, because I think fees touch on a lot of this stuff.
So on Ethereum, like it's just a peer-to-peer network essentially. So everyone's listening to the mempool. There's not like this concept of like a leader gets the transaction first, like on Solana, and then it forwards it to other leaders on the network. It's actually like a shared mempool. You send it to anyone, any node on the network, right? they have this like buffer-ish thing called a mempool. And when they get it in there, they then like gossip it around the network, right? And so you can almost think of like transaction propagation part of like the block propagation mechanism in Ethereum being like the mempool. Okay, whereas in Solana, it's just like simple forwarding to the next leader. And so what happens there is that like there's kind of this like they're talking to each other, they're waiting till they get like the transactions in the mempool, and there's like a discrete time window in which like leaders on the network are waiting like to collect enough transactions to build a block. But there's also something like there's a lot of games in Ethereum about like, okay, I need to make sure 2/3 of the gossip network has seen this transaction before I propose it in a block, because if I do, like, and no one else has it, like my block's going to get rejected, right? And if in Ethereum, this isn't like a huge deal because block times are so long that there's just like a point at which like the probability of that is like pretty much guaranteed. So that's kind of their like transaction propagation. As compared to Solana, it's literally like you just send it to a leader, you know, the scheduler, and so like you can just send it to the next couple of leaders, and like hopefully one of them gets it. But as you can see, that might be incentivizing spam, right? Because you can just send it to a bunch of leaders. And we can talk about how to prevent that and stuff. So that's like transaction propagation, but then there's actually like block propagation, right? So then the leader needs to like take these transactions, pack a block. We can get into like scheduling and how that has to deal with fees and whether in protocol or out of protocol. But essentially, they have like God mode. They have all these transactions that they're getting, and they go, okay, this is the order. And then they have to like broadcast that order to the rest of the network. Okay. And this is also like what takes a long time. Okay. Because now they're like sending a lot of bandwidth out of them to everyone else in the network and saying like, these are all the transactions I have. Typically that's like one of the heaviest parts of like bandwidth overhead on the network. In Ethereum, it's a little more balanced between like transaction propagation and block propagation. Because like, yeah, just because the way they've like slid where you do that, you know, they have kind of the buffer in the front. In Solana, it's much more like the leader gets it and it's packing it out, and then it needs to like very efficiently send it out because like their time to like keep listening is very limited, right? And then the next validator is like listening and trying to do the same thing as quickly as possible, and they're not waiting for each other to get the full blocks. Actually, in Solana, like they're like simultaneously like block 0 and block 1 are like streaming into each listening validator, and they're like building it, and they just hope that block 0 finishes before block 1 so they can vote on it and then vote on the next one, right? And that usually plays out that way just because of the leader schedule. But there's definitely the possibility that like block 1 finishes first, and then like the guy is still waiting on block 0 and he has to vote on both in the next slot. Like there's things like this that happen with Solana. But essentially, in order to do that, like, so they like just like the mempool optimization like isn't there. They don't have like this discrete time window. It's more of like continuous streaming of transactions. And so Turbine becomes like really, really important because it's playing the role of like both these things. Okay. And so like Turbine, like the theory behind it is like in Tendermint consensus, which is probably like the one a lot of people have heard about. It's been around for a long time. It's kind of like the base PBFT kind of consensus mechanism. Like when a leader gets something, it sends it to everyone, and then it waits for everyone to send it back to them. And all of those people also duplicate it. So it's like end to end. It's all to all communication for every like block. Okay. And so that creates like a lot of overhead on the network. So Solana was like, oh, what's a lot smarter is we like come up with this tree structure. Okay. And then you send it to one guy, and then he disperses it to a couple other nodes. They disperse it to a couple other nodes. And you get like this algorithmic property of dispersion. And like that's kind of where your stake weight comes in and like where you sit in that tree. And so having more stake means typically it means you're more trusted. It's kind of like a proxy for like how legit of a validator you are. And so they're like, okay, well, that's motivation to put you farther up in the tree because you probably have better service, and like or can send out shreds better and just have like better network properties. Yeah, and so that's kind of the difference there. I don't know if I missed on anything. Maybe if John wants to put some finer points on some stuff.
Yeah, I think it would just be emphasizing the main difference is really discrete time versus continuous time at a high level. Of Ethereum's entire block production process is very much a discrete process. Of it is a long block time where you're not doing anything for most of it, and then you are like all of a sudden sending a large block, and then you're propagating that throughout the network, and it takes time and all these different things. And in practice, effectively every single, I think it's like 95% plus of Ethereum validators that has completely outsourced that block production right at the end of the slot. They just get the block from the builder, and like that's what goes out to the rest of the network, as opposed to Solana, where the default and what the majority of clients still run is this Solana Labs client, which has this default continuous block building throughout your entire slot that you are doing yourself. And you're starting to see like growing within Solana, moving at least somewhat directionally towards Ethereum with what Jito is doing. Like the Jito auction is very analogous in a lot of ways to Mev Boost, the PBS implementation on Ethereum, just much faster and much shorter. And it's also not entire blocks; it's bundles. But it's the same idea of like Jito, which is I think it's like 43%, 44% of clients or something like that at this point are running this and can participate in the Jito auction, which is to some extent like slowing down and discretizing time. Of you have these 200 millisecond auctions where you are not just continuously block building throughout that, like you are building up this kind of auction, and you can send along like these are the good bundles, this is what you should prioritize. And like there that like the part of the problem is like the scheduler is a like rough attempt to be efficient and continuous block building, and the main thing is like the validator trying to be profit maximizing. The profit maximizing thing is generally to wait as long as possible and try to discretize time more. And like that's exactly what you're seeing in Ethereum is they already have long blocks with discrete time. What you're seeing proposers start to do in the last couple months or so is they realize like, hey, I could actually wait like a little bit longer than I'm supposed to wait. And that's what they're starting to do is like they're waiting past the time where they're supposed to send out the block to the rest of the network as like an honest proposer. And because they realize they can push it a little bit longer and like still get the block propagated to the rest of the network where it won't get reorged out. Similarly in Solana, like it is generally going to be profit maximizing to run at least some form of auction as opposed to just always continuously and kind of blindly producing blocks like this. And like that is part of the incentive for like something like Jito to increase adoption over time. It is just going to be more profit maximizing for the validators to slow down time to at least some extent.
And this is why Solana had those outages early on, was there was no mechanism to control for just spam hitting this leader block. They just took everything, and there was instances where the leader would go down. I mean, is that basically what happened? Solana got DDoSed. There was no like spam prevention mechanism. And have they really fixed it at this point with things like V markets and QoS and the other things you guys brought up?
So like I would say they have fixed the fact that spam brings down the network. They have not fixed the economic incentive to stop spamming the network. And like that sounds like kind of a convoluted thing, and so we'll get into like why that's an issue. But essentially, yeah, like the way the scheduler works right now on Solana is like there's 4 or maybe I'll talk about QoS and stake weighted quality of service a little bit because we already hit them. But so doing those things is like having the turbine tree basically put the higher quality nodes farther up in the tree so they have better block propagation. Like that was one thing. Okay. Quality of service is the other thing that John was talking about, where like if you have more stake and you're connected to a validator, you actually have like a slightly bigger bandwidth lane to send it transactions. So it's kind of like a reputational thing. It's like, hey, like I'm a trusted actor on the network. A lot of people have stake with me. So like you should kind of prioritize, like give me more bandwidth to send you stuff. Before that, they just had UDP. And this is going to get a little bit in the weeds here, so bear with me. UDP was just like, as someone on the network, I'm just saying like, I have an open door, send me stuff. But you don't know who's sending you stuff. You don't know like the quality of it. You don't have any way to limit it, right? And so it was just like, my doors are open, and you're just like, putting as much people through it as like you can. Okay. the reason they didn't want to do TCP, which is what like Ethereum uses on typical gossip networks, is because there's a lot of like back and forth in that protocol, and that back and forth like slows down like these transactions a lot. So what they moved to was something called Quick, which is kind of like a middle ground between that, and in the sense that like at the beginning of making a connection, there's a handshake so that the guy listening knows who you are, and then he opens the door all the way. And then because he knows who you are, he can say like, oh, you're sending me too much stuff. Like, I'm going to close the door in your face. Okay. Like it has the ability to do that. Before it didn't. So that's like the quick benefit. Right. And so both those things brought a lot of network stability, but they don't, like the local fee markets don't necessarily guarantee inclusion in the ways that we think about them. Right. So right now, and now I'll get a little bit more into the scheduler. The way the scheduler works is there's 4, you can think of them, they're called banking threads, but you can think of them as like lanes of traffic. Okay. And you don't actually know when you send a transaction to a validator what lane of traffic you're going to land in. Okay. And so you hear a lot of people in this discussion talking about jitter. And jitter is this concept of like, when I send my transaction, I don't know which thread I'm going to land in, which lane I'm going to land in. And I don't know how many cars are in that lane. Right. Like, and so the network is like trying to figure out the best way to put you, but it only schedules your priority per lane. Right. So you could pay a priority fee, but get in the most clogged lane. And even though you move to the front of that lane, like the next lane might be open, and because it's parallel, it's going before, right? And so 2 people with the same priority fee, or even one without a priority fee, if they land in the unclogged lane, can actually beat someone with a priority fee. And like, that's really the issue. Okay. And so like, you hear this as like jitter. Okay. And what they're really talking about is like, there's no guarantee right now that if I pay a priority fee, like I actually am the first one. Like I'm top of block or whatever. It's just that like I have a better chance of moving to the front of my lane, but I have no guarantee about how clogged my lane is. And so where this helps like network stability is in the sense of like, okay, it's at least smart enough to like be trying to schedule things in lanes and like making sure that each of those have like, aren't overloading the computer. So it's making the block time expand and then like causing things to like go down and stuff. But it's not actually doing the perfect world of like local fee markets that we think about. Really, it's just like saying like we're just distributing load across these threads right now.
Understood. And then the next thing I guess to touch on would be like maybe as we're talking about priority fees, why don't we step back a bit and just talk about fees? Like, how do they work on Solana? As far as I know, there's base fee. It's pretty low, pretty de minimis. And then what you're alluding to is priority fees, which have a cap. I forget off the top of my head what that cap is, and then all the fee in totality, half of it is sent to the validators and half is burned. What am I missing? Like, give me the lowdown on Solana fees.
Yeah. So the basic, I'll try to like comp it to Ethereum as I go through it, because I feel like that's a good reference point for most people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the way that the base fee works in Solana, so lamp ports are effectively the equivalent of like kind of a GUI in Ethereum. Yeah. It's like it's like the same kind of unit. Basically, there is a fixed base fee for every single signature of 5,000 lamp ports. And what that basically translates to is 5,000 lamp ports per transaction, because pretty much effectively every transaction has one signature. Versus on Ethereum, the way that you would calculate the base fee is a product of how much gas are you using. And then the analogous version of that, so it's gas in Ethereum is like the measure of like basically how much computation are you doing. CUs, compute units, are the equivalent in Ethereum, in Solana. But in Ethereum, basically, like the way that the base fee per transaction is set is like how much computation is this thing actually doing? So the amount of gas the transaction uses multiplied by whatever is the base fee at the moment. And then the base fee itself is dynamic in every block. It's part of consensus. This is the EIP 1559 mechanism of the base fee for a given block is based on like what is the trailing demand of, how full was the last block. If there was a lot of demand before, then we raise the base fee. And so the way that you calculate your transaction base fee is like how much gas is this actually using times what is the the prevailing base fee. And so that's the base fee on both sides. In Ethereum, you burn 100% of it for the reasons that we mentioned before. Of when you have this kind of mechanism, you need to burn it just for incentive compatibility, or it turns back into a first price auction. In Solana, they do a 50-50 burn and priority fee, somewhat randomly chosen number. And then the priority fee in Ethereum is like a simple 100% of it gets paid to the leader. So that is a mechanism by which you're trying to express like additional, hey, I really want to get into this block. Because the base fee is like the kind in Ethereum is the like, this is the prevailing price of, this should get you into the block, but you want to include like some additional amount that incentivizes the miner, the validator, like actually include your transaction that actually goes to them. So in normal times, you attach like a really small priority fee to your transaction because blocks generally have room and you'll get included right away. In times where it's really congested, you'll jack up a high priority fee, and then that will presumably get you included relative again to like how much compute your transactions are using, price and gas. So in Solana, the priority fee is more similar to Ethereum in that the priority fee is, again, this is like the priority fee. Prioritizing transactions based on this is out of protocol. It is up to like the scheduler determination, in the same way it's up to like a builder on Ethereum to just decide like, hey, is this a priority fee that this does it for me, this is worth it for me to include. So this is what the scheduler is taking into account, is this kind of optional priority fee. And when they account for this, they do account for the fact of, okay, what is the priority fee relative to the amount of computes CUs that this transaction actually uses. So there they actually do take into account the actual size of the transaction. The difference in the allocation of it is, and this is something which I think needs to change, doesn't make any sense to me. In Solana, again, they arbitrarily just burn 50% of the priority fee and then send 50% of it to the leader. That just like doesn't make any sense from an incentive compatibility thing. And like the result of that is like something like Jito can just directly transfer 100% of it instead. Like, let's just fast forward this thing and like you can send 100%, along. So in Ethereum, you see there's kind of like an indifference between like, if you're a searcher trying to express preference to a builder, you can either attach a high priority fee, or you could, attach a Coinbase.transfer, which directly transfers to ETH. And like those two things are like more or less the same in Ethereum world. In Solana world, it just doesn't make sense to use a priority fee for this fast lane if you like really know what you're doing, because like the leader is incentivized to obviously take 100% of this thing by this like out of band channel. So that's the kind of basic idea between the two. A lot of the discussion in Solana is around like, okay, is that the right method for the base fee? This was kind of like the naive, simple way to set it in the first place was just like, yeah, like signature verification is like roughly the more computationally intensive part of the transaction. So let's just like put a flat thing on everything. The problem with that is obviously like, okay, but now there's a lot of demand to get into a block and I'm a user and I just want to know what the fee to like get into the block is. Just like tell me what the fee is and I want to pay it to get in. You can't really do that in Solana. So priority fees are trying to like roughly add that on to the user of like allowing them to express like, hey, I just want to get in this block, man. Like, please let me in. The problem is that is like also a relatively imperfect mechanism. So you still get the result of, when the network is super congested, you can have this like, hey, I attached a priority fee, but then my transaction just got like dropped like 2 seconds later. Like, what the hell? I try again and the same thing happens. Like you can still see that in really congested times. Whereas like while EIP 1559 is like a slower mechanism, it is like much more accurate in kind of today of like, hey, I know what I need to pay to get in. Like maybe it takes me a block or two and like it's going to get included. So it is kind of like trading off those two things of like the speed versus what is like more accurately pricing resources and allocating them based on like who actually wants them.
If I can double click a little bit just to maybe clarify for the listener some of the things John was saying. I think like an important like motivational point about like fee markets is to like the base fee in Ethereum is very much like the network saying like you need to pay this amount just to get in the block. And so it's kind of an auction of like, do I get in or do I not, right? And then the priority fee is like, where in the block do I want to be? And this is like it's a very hand wavy type. It's like trying to do that because there's not like segmented block state. It doesn't really work that way. But essentially, it's trying to let you express like, hey, I'm willing to pay so much. Like, don't only put me in the block, but like put me in first, right? Now, builders, that's a really imperfect mechanism because like builders have other incentives to look at like what else is going in the block and like reorder things to the best of like their profit, because none of this is in protocol. But it is good to call out that like roughly speaking, like this is kind of the motivation, right? Is like you want to have a way to say I just want to get in, and then you also want to have a way to say where in the block I want to be. I don't think either fee mechanism is perfect in segmenting that, but it's just good to understand that this is kind of like the fee market problem, and that there is a little bit of a distinction between different actors who want to do these things. And so on the where to get like in the block, you see this being a lot of times like out of protocol with flashbots and MEB and like all that stuff, right? Whereas the base fee is just trying to model like what it is to get in the block. And so, yeah. Going back to Solana fees, I guess what I wanted to like kind of put a finer point on there was like the base fee right now on Ethereum, like it's dynamic in the sense that it's looking at how much the block is, right? But it's also dynamic in the sense of that it's looking how complex the transaction is. And in Solana, there's a discussion about separating both those things. Okay. And so it's kind of an open discussion if they want to make the base fee dynamic. And it's also a separate open discussion if they want to charge per complexity. And so the reason I want to describe all that is because like you do have to understand that these are both different considerations that are being like talked about in Solana right now. And it's not just like, oh, like let's copy Ethereum. It is very much like, okay, do we want to scale them with complexity? And then also, do we want to scale it for block inclusion? Or because like block inclusion through priority fee is an inaccurate mechanism, maybe the priority fee is the thing that captures the block inclusion and the base fee just captures complexity. And so that's kind of the philosophical difference there, right, between the two fee models.
Yeah. And one of the things I'd probably kind of double click on again a little bit is that point you're making of like the inclusion versus ordering. So that is like an important point of both for Ethereum and for Solana. There is no like deterministic ordering in protocol of no matter what fee you pay, there is no guarantee that like you will get in the block at the position that you want. That is roughly a strong guarantee that a builder on Ethereum can give you, because they're just going to build the block and you're going to tell the Flashbots builder or Beaver builder or whoever else that you're sending it to, like, hey, please just only include this transaction if I actually get what I want. And if I don't, then just like throw it away and I won't pay it. But that is like fundamentally an out of protocol guarantee that like you're assuming that the builder is rational and that like they are going to build up all these transactions and then they will sort them in the block according to like what is the most profitable. And if your transaction reverts, like they're just not going to get paid for it. There is at least some discussion, I would say, in Solana of you can make ordering deterministic within the protocol. And there's some discussion in Solana, and there's actually a reasonable amount of discussion of something similar to this in Arbitrum, where the basic idea is like you would just have the kind of first pass of consensus. They're just like signing off on like, hey, these are the transactions, like this is the order that I saw them, like throw them in there without like having an execution of them of like, hey, this is the result of it. And what you would then deterministically, it would be part of consensus, is you would just order them by priority fees effectively. And then like the higher priority fees in order would just be like at the top and they would get priority. So this is actually very similar to like what Arbitrum is going to do with, or at least is proposing to do with Time Boost, which is like this sort of mix of like, you're going to have this deterministic ordering of like the highest priority fees will go at the top. You do end up with like, there's like the interesting thing is like, this sounds like a good idea, like at least on the face of it. There is, because like, yeah, the person who paid more should go first. A lot of the pushback on it is like, you can see the opposite result is like, most of these transactions, at least a lot of them, are like going to fail, and you do end up with an all pay auction of like, you're just gonna have a bunch of failed transactions in here that we kind of threw in there, and then like someone's gonna get the highest bid, but they didn't like actually price it accurately, like you have a bunch of spam in there. What a builder on Ethereum, someone out of protocol, can do is just like, hey, you sent me all the bids, I'm just going to include the one that like actually won and put that in when I build the block. Again, it's this trade-off of like, what is the more efficient use of resources at the end of the day versus like, do we want to just do this thing as fast as possible, like jam it in there, and then like we kind of figure out the ordering, after like whatever works. Like there is generally that latency versus efficiency trade-off, and like allowing an out of protocol actor to kind of do these things. I don't think that Solana will go in that direction. I don't think that proposal makes a lot of sense. I think more of the serious discussion, especially in the shorter term, is like, what should we do with the base fee, and like, how do we make the priority fees like better, and like more accurate to express like, what a user wants.
What about, so I think that makes sense. Maybe zooming out a bit, touch on this topic of governance, kind of how it's different in each ecosystem. I think Solana has kind of had this history of an ability to move really fast, but I think that's changing now with the emergence of these alternative clients like Jito. And so maybe things will slow down. But I guess the broader point is like, how do you view, and I think the opposite argument can be said in Ethereum, where things can maybe move too slowly in some ways. And that's always been a criticism. And maybe guys, let's jam a bit on like, what makes sense? Like, how does this play out in the long term? What differences are you guys noticing?
Okay, to motivate that like a little bit, I do want to like step back and like talk about like why the governance question comes up in the fee discussion. And it's to the point that John made, is like a lot of scheduling, like it doesn't actually have to be in protocol. Like a rational block builder is, if there's the right fee mechanism, is motivated to like extract those fees in a way that gives like the best UX to for price discovery, as well as like to the user, right? If this is very much if the fee mechanism is designed the correct way. And so it becomes very much a question of like, can we design a fee mechanism that when an out of protocol scheduler looks at it, they're motivated to schedule it in a way that's best for the user and best for the network itself. Okay. And that's really this like big overarching question, right? And this is like what governance is trying to like figure out, right? Is what do we believe is the proper incentive mechanisms such that like the scheduling and all that is done in a way that's healthy for the network. Okay. So typically on like Ethereum, right, I think I wasn't involved in a lot of the early governance, but just empirically, it's a much more robust conversation. I think that's very much because they have multiple clients. And I think you're starting to see this like rear its head in Solana now, is that, you have the Fired Answer team looking at the client code. You have Jito looking at the client code. You have some really sophisticated DeFi teams looking at the client code. And now you have labs, right? And so you have 4 pretty sophisticated actors who all like have seen how the sausage is made and see the problems in the scheduling and the fees, and have like slightly different opinions on like how those incentives should be shored up to motivate the scheduling problem for their particular use cases. And that's why this discussion like becomes a governance problem. And so just anecdotally, I think, like at Breakpoint this year, right, there was a Mev camp, right, and there's like a discussion on like RPCs and making them faster, and the room is just like packed. Okay, and then it moves to like a governance discussion, and most of the room leaves, and it's like me and David from Bankless sitting there and like just like the 5 people talking about governance on stage, and I was like, this is incredibly ironic. And so like I think like to date, right, like the governance has been very much like, because there's like one dominant client, it's like your vote is, do I upgrade or not, in the same way that like Bitcoin governance is like, do you run that client or not? And if you don't, it's a hard fork, right? You just get forked off the network. Like that is your vote. now that these problems are starting to touch like multiple clients, it's like very much like that can't be it. Like Firedancer cannot move differently than the Solana Labs client, or like they're separate networks. And I think like we're starting to really see this governance problem come to a head in these fee discussions because of the different motivations of the different actors.
So then what about, and I think, John, you kind of alluded to this earlier, what is the answer? Like, what do you guys think? Like, how would you predict fees will pan out on Solana? Is it like the obvious thing is that we don't burn half of it and we just give it all to the validators? But what about the base fee? I mean, do we think that'll go up? I mean, what are some ideas that are proposed in the discussions you guys are listening in on?
So I don't think that there is a perfect answer. If I'm to like cut to the real end of it in like 5-10 years from now, I think we just pick a spot on the trade-off spectrum based on like what is this thing meant to be. Because I just don't think that there's a perfect solution to all of these. And that is actually like part of also why I'm like excited to see more like SVM forks in the future and like people like Eclipse, because I think that they should be much more incentivized to be like, we're going to change something, see if it works. Like I think that more SVM chains are going to be willing to do that, especially ones that are like in the more like Ethereum community and mindset of like they're going to be more inclined to play around with the things that are like, yeah, we see this works in Ethereum and like that's the community, and they're going to be like similar research community. I think people are going to play around with different things, and I think that'll be great. And I think that you end up with like some balance in the middle. I think the stuff that is probably like more likely for Solana in the medium term, I mean, the one that I would say, the one that'll definitely happen is the kind of outer protocol of just like improvements to the scheduler. Like that is going to change. That there is going to be new work. I think it'll probably be released in like 118, and then like probably mandatory like after that. But like there are expected changes in the scheduler to just like kind of alleviate these. It's not a perfect solution, but the things that we're talking about of like it's just like a pretty imperfect implementation to the thing today. There's a lot of randomness and like trying to just like make that a generally more reliable mechanism of like just making the priority fees just do a better job of what they're trying to do, as opposed to the like rough first implementation of it. That's an out of protocol thing. I would say the more in protocol stuff that gets like talked about a lot more is the changes to the base fees. I think that is like more likely as like a medium term thing, as opposed to like a lot of the other stuff that's talked about. So the simplest thing to do would be to have the base fee, at least to some extent, take into account like what are the resources being used by this transaction. So the simplest way to do that is just to make the base fee like you literally pick a fixed number like it is today of like 5,000 LAMP ports, and like you basically back into the math of like what is the fixed number of LAMP ports per CU that like ends up with like roughly the same base fees being per block. We're just attributing it to CUs as opposed to signatures. There's a very reasonable counterpoint that like signatures actually disproportionately do take a reasonable amount of effort, like signature verification, and you shouldn't just use CUs. So it would also potentially be reasonable to have some like minimum amount to account for the fact of like this is the signature verification cost, like roughly, and then if you have a bunch of CUs, then there's some additive amount, like some multiplier beyond that. That like the simplest way to do that is to just have like a fixed number of like this is the base fee and like whatever the formula is. That still wouldn't be dynamic in the way that EIP 1559 is, where like the network level fee, like that is actually trying to meter demand, is changing from block to block. My guess is that some variation of that will eventually work its way into Solana. I think that it just will need to at some point. I don't have a high degree of confidence of like what that will look like. There is a lot of talk of should you have this number. Some of the proposals are to just like basically have the validators after like each epoch or whatever amount of time say like, hey, this is what we think it should be adjusted to. Like this more accurately accounts for like our resources and the current pricing of the network. And then you take some like median of that, and like that's the base fee. You could do an EIP 1559 like one where there's just this like global base fee, and you'd look back of like, okay, how full was the last block based on some target, and then we increase or decrease it. Another one is, and this is where you start to see like there's a ton of different proposals. Another one is to like, okay, can we try to do that locally for different accounts? Of instead of having this globally IP 1559 like Ethereum has, do we have like a different curve basically for like each piece of state? You can imagine how that would get very complex very quickly. And I'd say probably the last major one, which we'll definitely get into, is PRA. If you want to take that one, Kevin, as a start.
Yeah. I can delve into that. So I do want to call out a couple of fine points. Is that like you can kind of back in to the Lamports for CU math by looking at the validator votes. And so I think this is one way of thinking about like profitability of like the sustainability of the network, is you can actually say like, how much am I what's the minimum stake that I'm going to say that you need to be like profitable on the network? And then like how many votes, how many other validators votes do I need to get to meet like that break even profit? And then you can back into a number of like how much a vote per CU should be. So you can make a assumption of like, I want 80% of the validators to be profitable with the validator set size of say 10,000. And then you can back into a number of what the base Lamports per CU should be based on the CUs of a vote, right? And then from there, you can like price everything else based on CUs because you have a base number there. I think the part about the validators voting for it, because that vote number has a numerator in Solana, like Lamports, right, is having the validators be able to say, oh, okay, like the network economics have changed, like we should also be able to vote on that. Okay. And then really just offloading the contention problem to the priority fees. But like John was saying, we'll see if that works. Like there might need to be like a EIP 155 type mechanism as well. I think the way the thinking is right now is like, one, the first thing that needs to be done is remove jitter and scheduling. And so that's just like not have this 4-lane problem. Like right now, it's actually like in a lot of cases, like your guarantee of inclusion is actually more timing based than priority fee based. And that needs to change. Like the priority fee does not need to actually capture your preference, not how close you are on the network or how much you can spam or any of that, right? And so the scheduling problem kind of helps that. And then what we talked about with the fees. And then there's another kind of double layer here when we look into like Eclipse and app chains and the level of sovereignty that they have over their block space. And this is really where it gets like on a general purpose chain, there's this balance between how sovereign should your block space be, right? On an app chain, you get to make all the decisions, right? On a shared state chain, like you're kind of subject to the fee model of the chain itself. And so if you have like a special application, you don't really have a way to say like, wait, no, this is my state. And like, I just want to charge more for it. You know what I mean? Like, screw it. I just want like my app to have some sort of fee capture mechanism because why not, right? But like, I can't do that in Solana right now. And that's like a big reason why you would go to an app chain, is because you can be like, okay, I can do things like blast and like where I can just like juice yields because I want to, right? And like, I think something we saw that was pretty funny is Zeta was getting sybiled after the airdrops, and they just go, okay, we're just going to raise state rent. Right. Like, so if you make an account, like you're just going to have to put up a bond of like 2.5 SOL, like to even trade on us. Right. And so that way it like disincentivizes bots from just like making a bunch of accounts and like spamming them. Right. So there's like definitely this motivation for apps to like want to have some control over their block space, and pros are kind of a way to essentially like let them express that. So what a PRA is, what it stands for is, and this is like really hard naming, so bear with me here, but it's priority.
No.
Right, locked account fees. Yeah, do you know, John, what is it?
It's program rebatable account right fees.
There
We
we go.
we li-
There
we
we
literally
go.
had we
Yeah.
had a meeting on like Tuesday night with like 20 of us talking about Solana fee stuff, and it took the room like 30 seconds or so to like collectively come together on like what the name is.
Yeah.
Between like this and Token 2022 and like a bunch of other
Oh,
things,
man.
like Solana could probably improve the naming on some
The
things.
engineering naming is terrible. And then like SIMDs are the equivalent of EIPs. And
Yeah.
it's like
Oh
a
my
play
God.
on like parallel processor SIMDs, but it's also like it doesn't make sense.
It's super annoying.
Yeah. But yeah, okay. So essentially priority
Programmable.
right programmable pros. We're just gonna call it pros. Yeah. Allow an app to say like, hey, if you touch my state, like there's conditions on that state. Like I can set conditions on that state. And you can actually like do that right now in Solana, but only if the transaction is successful. Okay. And so like it ends up kind of exposing like almost, you could think of it as a runtime bug. It's like in Ethereum, because state and data is like together, when you go to access a program, like, and it fails, it still fails within like the process control of like the executor. Okay. And so like the app can still say like, oh, well, you failed within my context. Like I'm going to charge you anyways. Okay. And Solana, it like doesn't have that mechanism yet. And so the argument, like even if you were to like not agree with like the sovereign block space argument, the argument is kind of like, hey, like the VM should actually like a failed transaction should still be in the control flow of the app, right? It shouldn't like just revert, because what we're seeing is like on like DEX markets or stuff, you'll see arbitrageurs like come in, lock a bunch of accounts and like make a bunch of trades and see which ones are profitable. And if none of them are, they'll just put a forced revert in there. And then they'll just revert out and they don't get penalized for doing any of that, because the program doesn't get to say like, no, you can't do that. You can't like lock and revert and like not get charged for it. And so essentially pros are kind of trying to express a way for an app to say like, maybe I want conditions on my state. Okay. Maybe I have like a piece of data that should never be called into from anything other than like my program. Right. And so because in Solana, you can declare state up front, like some random actor could just be like, I don't want this market to get liquidated, so I'm just going to spam this account. And so the program itself can never get access to it. Okay. And so then as an app, you're going like, crap, I'm trying to do something. Some arbitrageurs locking my account and I have no way to penalize them for like doing this incorrect behavior because they've declared that like they want to lock it up front. And so like pros are a way to say like, okay, the control, like you actually have to pay for that. And so it disincentivizes spam in the sense that they could be like, no, you're going to get taxed if you try to do that, like pretty heavily. And otherwise, like, this is my state, like I have control over it. And then it gets into like conversations of like sovereignty, like where do you feel like the program should have sovereignty over its state, or should it be more of a network thing?
For sure. It was great we finally got to the right way to handle that acronym. So
Yes.
I have we have the kind of ultimate set of people here for this, I guess, final topic or question. And I know it's not directly related to fees, it's more indirectly, but I think in an earlier answer, John alluded to this, which is that we can start to see experiments with this with projects that are using the SVM but aren't literally Solana, like Eclipse, for instance. Can you help us and the listener understand better, like concretely, what does this stack that Eclipse, when they launch, what would that look like? So like Eclipse is the SVM, right? So like the smart contracts are written the same way you would do it on Solana, but it's very much in the ETH ecosystem. So help us fill in the blanks here in terms of what are they borrowing from Solana exactly, and then what are they borrowing from ETH, and then what end user experience is being created by all of this?
Yeah. I mean the intention is for the end user and developer experience to be like abstract away everything that is different in the backend, because like the execution environment just looks the same. It's an SVM fork. So like keep that really looking the same, and like, hey, this is what nodes run, everything looks roughly the same. The basic idea would be that it's like, this is such a made up word, but it quote unquote settles to Ethereum in the way that like everyone describes it. Concretely, what that means is like basically you have a bridge contract on Ethereum, which is you're effectively like delegating your fork choice rule to that bridge and to the underlying chain. It's kind of recognition of the fact that like, hey, the purpose of this chain is really in service to like quote unquote scaling the underlying chain. Like, it's where all the users are going to come from, all the important assets, all the interesting stuff. It's going to be in that bridge anyway. And then what you're functionally doing with a rollup like this, so they will use Celestia for DA. What you're functionally doing is like you're basically just replacing the consensus of the chain with this other DA layer. Like a DA layer is a blockchain. Like it's just another chain that you put like every chain is a DA layer. You are posting your data to another chain, which is like optimized to just like have a shit ton of data sent through it without executing it, without doing all these different things. It is just optimized for that single purpose. And so like the main trade-off that it definitely is a trade-off that it allows you to kind of do is like, hey, we have this different consensus set that handles all this stuff for us. We're not going to deal with this like complex, we try to have 2,000 validators that are trying to globally sync around the world and like immediately update the state of the world. And like all these million problems that we just talked about that are like, there is no perfect solution to all these things. It's super complicated. It's unclear if it works, like all these different things. It's like, hey, we're just going to like have Celestia consensus like 12 seconds later or 15 seconds later. And in between that, we're just going to have like a single sequencer or a small sequencer set that can just like do all the optimal things that we just talked about of like, hey, we could just have like continuous or like really, really fast batching and just like do the optimal ordering in that based on like, we know this is what users want. This is what they're trying to express, all those different things. Just makes it greatly just simplifies the design space and just allows you to move quicker. Like they're going to partially by need have different fee markets than Solana because like they will have the fundamentally like different underlying like DA layer market that is a market that like users will have to pay for. So that will fundamentally change it. And then like, why not just go experiment with things? Like try different base fees, like go implement prof fees, like go do these things on these different SVM forks because like it's going to get increasingly harder and harder to do. It's the same way with like, it's the same thing on Ethereum.
Exactly.
Of like Ethereum is not about to go change their fee market. This is like one of the few things though, like making fundamental breaking changes to the EVM, like other EVM chains are bound by that. Like they're not going to go do that. But you can play around with fee markets. Like that is within the realm of like, that's one of the things that you can actually play around with quite a bit. At least to a meaningful extent. And like different rollups have different fee markets. They do different ordering mechanisms. They do all these different things. So like different SVM chains can go play around with these things because Solana is like being practical, like not going to implement most of these things, particularly in like a shorter time scale because of the things that we were talking about earlier. Like it is getting more mature and they're like, hey, we have multiple client teams now. And like, we think this is a good idea, but like the fire dancer guys are telling us this is a really bad idea. And like, they don't want to implement it. So like, we're probably not going to implement it. Like you start to have more of those as opposed to like one, streamlined team that can like, oh, we'll implement it. Like, see what happens, like see if it works. Like there is that more natural, like kind of early stage incentive that like, you're going to see that more. And like prof fees are something like I think are cool. Like I think that Solana, they make sense, especially like philosophically to me. I think for general purpose chains to work in the long run and like not have everyone eventually have this incentive to like go have my own chain, you do need to kind of push the boundaries of like what is the most control that we could possibly give to developers if they want it. And like that's one of the good things about like the pro design is like if you don't want to implement these on your app, it's like don't implement them, like set them to 0 and then like you don't think about it and you don't really need to deal with it. A lot of the trade-offs like within the Solana community and like talking around this is like it seems additive, it seems like it makes sense, but it's a lot of complexity. And it's like, hey, if we just improve the schedule and improve priority fees and do all these things, is it going to like solve enough of the issues anyway? And so like that is a lot of the Solana fee market conversation is like all of these things are related to each other. They're all addressing like similar problems in different combinations. And there's a lot of like, oh, do we really need this thing if like that other thing like sort of fixes it well enough? And that's like the thing with local fee markets is like, they're not perfect, but like they're definitely strictly additive. It seems like at least to some extent. And it's like none of these things are perfect. And it's just like, it's to some degree whack-a-mole. And it's like, we're just going to keep trying different things. And like, that's what Solana should do. And that's what other chains should do. Like, it's fun and it makes sense. Nobody knows what the perfect solution to any of this shit is right now. People got to try everything.
completely agree, and I think that's always been one of the key benefits, benefits of Solana's approach, building a new blockchain from first principles and just shipping fast and seeing how to fix it in real time. I mean, it's not ideal to do that, but it feels to me like the only way to do it in the long run. Just help me understand one thing really quickly. It's like a very simple question, but we're talking about Eclipse, and we're talking about settling in air quotes. I know it's a very it's hard to define what that really means, but just help us understand, like, why is it cheap then? Because ETH is expensive, right? Touching mainnet ETH is just fundamentally a costly thing. So what part of the stack makes it possible for that to be cheap? Like, how is it cheap for the end user executing on Eclipse? Is Celestia doing all of that? Is that the layer that's making this all possible?
Yeah, there's really two parts. So the settlement part of any L2 is like stupidly cheap. It's like you're posting some state roots and like some proofs every once in a while. Like that's really, really cheap. The costs to end users are primarily going to be the cost of like all of the data that you're posting. So Celestia, as being a new DA layer, is literally just optimized for solving this one problem of like, hey, how do we just have gigantic blocks and just send a bunch of data around and sign off on this thing and like do data availability sampling on it for like clients, make that available. But we just like don't worry about executing it. Like the rollups can go figure that out themselves. So that is the whole point. Is like Celestia is optimized for exactly that. Like we'll just have a lot more data available than if you were to post data on Ethereum, which is like super constrained. Even with 4844, like Ethereum DA will be like very, very small. The other part of it then is just like, what is the, this is where the more like local contention comes in, is like, what is the execution environment that you're using? So you can have a situation where even if you're using like a really cheap DA layer of, you know, let's say you have a single threaded, just like normal, like EVM roll up, and it has like pretty low gas limits because it's just like super conservative. It has these state growth problems. Even if your DA layer is cheap underneath, if just like everyone wants to use that one roll up, well, then the gas prices are going to go up on that roll up. And so that is what like Eclipse is trying to do, is like alleviate both of those, of like using the Celestia underneath for like the steady state of like, what is the cost of underlying DA? And they're like, hey, we're just going to use a better execution environment than all these other chains. So that like, we're not like bottlenecked within the execution itself, of like, hey, we could just have like a parallel execution environment with like higher gas limits, like closer to what Solana is, as opposed to just like a typical EVM fork, which like has lower gas limits, like is being conservative around state growth, like all those different things. So there's different bottlenecks depending on like what is the bottleneck in your rollup. But like both of them are very present. Like we see it at times where like, you know, gas fees will spike up on Arbitrum, but they're like the same on Optimism because like everyone just wants to do a thing on Arbitrum. That's where it'll help that like you're using their execution environment that just like is going to have like higher limits on it. Versus using Celestia will help with the fact that like their baseline costs for using Optimism and Arbitrum and all those right now is like, I don't know, it's gonna be like 50 cents or $1 or whatever, just to do a simple transfer or swap or something like that. And that's because like Ethereum DA is expensive. So it's just swapping out those different pieces. Whereas Solana itself is responsible for like all of those different components. Like Solana is its own DA layer. It's like the validators send it around themselves. And like that is the market there.
Yeah, I would point out a little bit of like, this is where I'm like, we'll see, because like, so on Eclipse, you get rid of vote overhead for bandwidth, right? Because you just have one sequencer, right? But like vote bandwidth is kind of what's going to end up moving to like Celestia, in the sense that like you're going to have a lot of rollups competing for this DA. Okay. And so if the Eclipse fork wants to use everything that like Celestia can provide, there's going to be another fee contention auction on the bandwidth of Celestia, right? And so even though you got rid of the votes, like you might have 10 different rollups bidding for the same DA space on Celestia. And as much as Celestia can scale, and it is like a sublinear scaling model, like it does have physical limits. Like you can't get around physics, right? And those limits tend to look somewhere along the same lines of like how many validators can you support, just because of like bandwidth overhead from votes. And so it is shifting like the burden of these things to different layers. I think I'm still like in the camp of like, we'll see. because like Celestia like just launched and like maybe it works really, really good, but if it gets a lot of Lindy and every rollup is like, I trust Celestia, I only want to use Celestia, you're going to see like DA fee market spikes as well.
Yeah,
So-
no one is cheating physics in any of this. It's all different trade-offs. Like those will be the like I would say 2 questions for something like Celestia in the long run. Is like one is the fundamental question of like how big can you get the pipe if you of just like raw data bandwidth through the system of something like Celestia versus something like Solana. If we just focus on doing exactly that, of can Celestia make that data pipe way bigger than Solana can make it at the end of the day, because like we have a different consensus and we don't need to worry about execution and really fast blocks and blah, 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 and all these things. And it's just like, it's just data bandwidth, just like send all the shit through there. Can you make that pipe a lot bigger? That's one fundamental question. And then the other fundamental question is like, all right, does everyone want to use the same pipe? Or the second that Celestia starts to get full, do we just like spin up another Celestia, or just like go use a Veil, or go use whatever the new thing is? Or are there real network effects? Like everyone actually wants to be in that same pipe? I tend to be on the side more of the latter of like if Celestia starts to get expensive, people are just going to go use some other DA. Like we already see that with Ethereum. Like Ethereum is really expensive, and that's why there's an incentive to go use these other things. If Celestia started to get expensive, I think it just like would lose its value proposition. So I think it's going to be just like see how big the pipe can be, and then if we need more data pipes, you're going to make more data pipes.
Yeah, then we run into problems of like synchronizing across rollups and shared sequencers, and even if they're using different DAs, now the shared sequencers have to all pull from those DAs in order to synchronize the state between the rollups. It's like you don't get around these problems. Like some layer is going to handle it, and the real question is like, will they actually handle it better separately than together? So
amazing. Well, thank you guys, both John and Zen, for taking time out from your busy schedules and helping us all learn a bit more about what's actually happening behind the scenes here. Yeah, this is super fun.
Thanks, man. It's a ton of fun, guys.
yeah, it was great.